Hello psychology students, welcome back. Today we're going to be diving into module 12 and 13 and we'll be talking about the cerebral cortex and hemispheric organization. These are our learning targets taken from College Board, and we got a lot to cover today, as you can see here. We'll be getting into the subdivisions and functions of the brains, identifying key researchers about certain association areas like Paul Broca, Carl Warnke. We'll be talking about Roger Sperry and his contribution to hemispheric organization. And then also we'll discuss neuroplasticity and Michael Gazzanica's research on neuroplasticity in regards to split brain research. All right, let's talk about areas of the cerebral cortex and what the brain is. So again, the brain is part of the central nervous system. It weighs about 3 pounds. You can hold it in the palm of your hands, and it contains billions of interacting neurons and glial cells. I believe there's about 80-some billion neurons in our brain. And really, if you think about the brain and what it does and all these amazing structures that work so intricately together with our bodies, it's truly a miracle and just beyond anything man could ever make with his own hands. And so you have these specific lobes and specific regions of the brain within the cerebral cortex, like the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. And we're going to talk about these. Then within those, you have association areas, and you also have hemispheres. You have your right hemisphere and your left hemisphere. So when you hear these words, cerebral cortex and cerebrum, they're really used interchangeably. Cerebral cortex would be the gray matter regarding the higher functioning skills. So it's that kind of like the outer layer of the bark, right, of a tree. And then you have the cerebrum, which would be the white matter just inside of the cerebral cortex. So looking here, this white matter kind of functions as a filler, right? It's thicker, fluffier, I guess you could say. And it's spongy. It's that spongy tissue within the brain tissue that you see here from the anatomy of this brain that's been cut in half here. So anything on the outer layer is technically the cerebral cortex. Anything inside here of that brain tissue would be the cerebrum. But again, we're going to use them interchangeably, and they basically mean the same thing. Now, looking at this overview of the structure of the cortex, we have the frontal lobe, which you can see is the pink. Okay, the parietal lobe, seen in the blue. The occipital lobe, located in the very back region there, and then the temporal lobe, which is located just over our ear. Now, within these lobes, you also have things called fissures. Okay, so the brain is divided into 2 hemispheres, and that line, or that fissure that divides those 2 hemispheres, is called the longitudinal fissure. So you can't see it here. It's not pictured here, but it is basically right here. Okay, right down the middle of your brain. And then you also have the central fissure. Okay, the central fissure is going to divide the frontal and the parietal lobes. And then you have the lateral fissure, which is that indentation, or that crease there you can see between the top of the frontal lobe, the top of the temporal lobe, and the bottom of the frontal lobe. Okay, so this little region right here would be the lateral fissure, and then this region right here would be the central fissure. Okay, and then this region up here, splitting the hemispheres, would be the longitudinal fissure. So let's first look at the lobes, and the first lobe we're going to look at here starts with F, frontal lobes, F for first. Okay, so the frontal lobe is located directly behind your forehead, and it is actually the largest of the 4 lobes, and it is also the last to fully develop. It doesn't actually develop till about age 25. So this specific lobe is responsible for our most advanced cognitive thinking abilities, like judgments, making plans. It's also responsible for movement of our muscles. So this is where we find the somatomotor cortex, or the motor cortex. And we also see links to personality through, we'll talk about here in a minute, through a case study, Phineas Gage. and also our emotional control. Now, because it is the last to develop, generally that's why you see maybe teenagers or young adults, they don't always make the best judgments in their lives and make a lot of foolish judgments because this region of the brain is not fully developed. Now, damage to this region of the brain will also result in difficulty making and carrying out plans and decision making, while also if this region of the brain is damaged, you may see some changes in personality and lack of ability to control emotions. Now, interestingly, if this region of the brain is overstimulated, we will have a difficult time making decisions, right? So this especially goes into play when talking about introverts and extroverts. So if you're someone who is more introverted, then generally they say your prefrontal cortex is more stimulated, and so therefore you need to be less stimulated. And so you want to get away from stimulating environments so that you can think and process about what has been happening throughout your day. Whereas someone who is more extroverted, their prefrontal cortex is less stimulated, and it needs more stimulation to be around people so that they can operate, think, and make these decisions. So there is some differences in how this prefrontal cortex and our frontal lobe operates in different personalities regarding introverts and extroverts. So I'm an introvert, and so stimulating environments, when I'm in a stimulating environment, sometimes teaching, I can't think very well, and my brain is just exhausted, and I have a hard time making decisions and even speaking sometimes. So things that generally come very naturally can be quite a challenge when our brain, and especially our prefrontal cortex, is overstimulated or understimulated, depending on which personality you fall under. So just an interesting fact regarding our frontal cortex. Now, this is the case study that I was referencing in that previous slide. Phineas Gage. Gage was a 25-year-old railroad foreman who was known for being a very efficient and friendly guy and hard worker. One day on the tracks, an explosive happened, and basically this iron rod went straight through his head, and Gage never lost consciousness. So he was actually conscious throughout the whole event, and he sat upright, and they put him in the ox cart. They carried him to the nearest inn. It was about a half a mile away, and again, this is 1846, so they didn't have cars to just throw him in the back of the car and get him to the hospital. They didn't have ambulances back then. So he was then met by Dr. John Martin Harlow, and Dr. Harlow, and he was the one who performed the very first neurosurgery ever in history. And what they found through this incident was that the injury changed his personality. And although his memory worked fine, and although he was still able to function, his motor skills were okay, he saw a vast difference in his personality and emotion. And he was very irritable and very angry and very rude and very unsociable. He had social impairment. And so this case study led us to further understanding the functions of the frontal lobe and how it is linked to personality and emotion. Now, the last region of the frontal lobe that we're going to look at is the motor cortex. And this area is at the rear of the frontal lobe, and it controls our voluntary movement. So different parts of the cortex control different parts of the body, but in a curious cross-wired pattern. We're going to talk about this more when we get into hemispheric specialization. But in 1870, German physicians found this region of the brain called the motor cortex through electrically stimulating animals' brains in this region, and they saw that when they stimulated it, it caused movement. So the same thing goes with us, right? If you stimulate this region of the brain, this cortex, then there will be muscle contractions. Now, the cortex, the motor cortex, is more focused on areas of the body that have fine control. Okay, so you look at this really strange creature here, the homunculus, and it is a representation of these weighted distributions of those fine motor controls and sensory controls of these specific regions of our bodies, right? Like our lips, our fingers, our toes, and our tongue. So our thighs, our shoulders, and our back, for instance, though, have less association to the motor and sensory cortexes, and so that's why these homunculus, strange-looking creatures look the way that they do. So they're strange, they're freaky-looking, but they're a good model of our understanding of how our bodies interact with the environment, and they show us what our bodies would look like in proportion to the space taken up by these actual regions of our motor and sensory cortexes. All right, so let's look at a little demonstration here regarding our motor movement and our right and left hemisphere and how they kind of function together. So go ahead and try moving your right hand in a circular motion, going in the direction of the right direction. Okay. Next, I want you to do the same thing with your foot. You're going to continue to go in this synchronized motion, going in the right direction with your hand and foot. And now I want you to go ahead and reverse your foot motion, but not your hand, just your foot. So, why is this so difficult? Okay? Why are you having a hard time with this? Well, generally it would be easier if we did the opposites with different regions of our body, right? If I move my left foot in a left motion and my right hand in a right motion, I can do that pretty easily. But I have a really hard time doing opposites on the same side of my body, okay? And that is because the left and the right hemispheres are controlled by opposite sides of the brain. And so the same hemisphere trying to do the opposite of the other, right, causes interference. And so we have a difficult time with that. We'll get into this more as we get into hemispheric specialization. The second lobe we're going to look at is located just behind the frontal lobe, and it is known as the parietal lobe. Okay, so the function of this region of the brain is generally for processing mathematical reasoning, okay, and also sensory information. So regarding touch, pressure, temperature, pain, anywhere located on our body, these types of pressures, these types of sensations are linked to the somatosensory cortex, which is in our parietal lobe. So that sensory cortex is located just behind the motor cortex. All right, and if it is electrically stimulated, just as the motor cortex, you're not going to move, but you're going to feel and report physical sensations. So as if somebody actually physically touched you, if that region of your brain is stimulated, it will feel like someone touched your arm, regarding on where on that somatosensory cortex has been stimulated. So, fun fact, Albert Einstein was someone who was actually incredible at mathematics, and they found that there was a brain abnormality with his brain compared to most human brains, and that was that his parietal lobe was actually somewhat expanded or larger than a typical brain. So this may be an explanation for his incredible mathematical reasoning abilities. So let's go ahead and look at the somatosensory cortex here. So when we look at the somatosensory cortex, we see that it's located in the front of the parietal lobe. So it's actually just behind the motor cortex, or the somatomotor cortex. And like the motor cortex, when we look at the homuncula, right, where it's more sensitive towards motor movements, this is going to be more sensitive to skin senses, right, like pressure, touch, pain, anything related to that. So when you feel a tickle, right, or like when you feel a tickle on your hands or on the palm of your feet, you're going to feel that sensory receptor is going to be more sensitive, more allocated towards that region of the body, whereas your, maybe areas on your back, the sensory receptors on your back are not going to be as linked to the somatosensory cortex. Okay, so if I were to touch your back, if I were to touch you on the back, and I were to ask you how many fingers did I touch you with on your back, how many fingers did I tap your back with, you're probably going to get it wrong, right? Whereas if I tapped you on the palm of your hands, or if I tapped you on the bottom of your feet, you would pick up on those sensory receptors much more quickly, because this region of the brain is much more linked to those areas of your body. So this is an image of an fMRI, which is an enhanced image of the brain, okay, and it shows us the functioning as well as the structures of the brain, right? Whereas an MRI is more so just based off of structures. It's a detailed image of the structures of the brain. So the fMRI here is showing how the brain is experiencing pain, okay, and pain would be the green area, right? Not all the other areas. Don't look at the other areas, but this is the green area is related to this person's experience of pain, okay? And then the red would actually be related to an emotion that our brain would be experiencing. So emotion is going to be more linked to our frontal lobe, right? And the structure of the brain, of the limbic system, that would be related to this would be the amygdala. All right, so the third region here of the brain, starting with the T, is the temporal lobe. Okay, so the temporal lobe meaning near the temples, and it's just below the parietal lobes on each side of the brain, just above the ears. Okay, and if you're looking at the region of the brain that kind of makes it more distinct in how we can recognize where it's at, that would be the top of the lateral fissure, right? So the lateral fissure is going to divide the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, and the temporal lobe. And so this is responsible for auditory processing and language, all right? And there's an area that's specifically associated to processing auditory information. That would be the auditory cortex. You also have areas of the brain like the Wernicke and the Broca area. These are association areas that we're going to talk about here in just a minute, and you find them within this region of the brain. So if it were damaged, if this area were damaged, you would obviously have language impairment, because the temporal lobe is responsible for language and speech processing. Not only just speaking, not only the motor movement involved, but also the comprehension of language is located in this region of the brain. And then you would have something called prosopagnosia. I'm not sure if I said that right, but it's basically it's face blindness, in which people are not able to recognize anyone's face, any familiar faces. So it's a long-term memory loss issue. And then the last region of the brain we're going to talk about here is the occipital lobe before we talk about the association area. So occipital lobe is primarily responsible for visual processing, located in the very back region of the cerebral cortex, and it is has the primary visual cortex, which is going to be functioning for any type of vision or visual perception processing. And major head injury in this region of the brain, in the back of your brain, could cause blindness, even if your eyes are not necessarily damaged, right? So if this region of the brain is damaged and your eyes are fine, well, your brain is not going to be able to process or perceive any incoming stimuli. Now, when we talk about association areas, okay, while mammals and animals are similar in a lot of ways, the more complex the organism, right, especially the human species, okay, this area, these association areas are generally very different and more developed, and we see this especially in humans in regards to the language functions, right, because humans are the only species that can speak an actual language and produce words. In the temporal lobe, we're going to talk about the Broca's area and the Wernicke's area. And so there are actually over 20 association areas in our brains that allow for higher level processing regarding visual, auditory, learning, speaking, and we've talked about some of those association areas kind of already, looking at like the somatosensory cortex, but we're going to talk about some more higher functioning mental skills regarding our language and remembering and thinking and speaking. All right, so the first association area here regarding the left temporal lobe that we're going to talk about is the Broca's area. So the Broca's area controls language expression in an area on the left frontal lobe that directs muscle movement involved in speech. Okay, so it's this little green area here on your screen that you can see. So in 1865, Paul Broca reported that damage to this region of the left frontal lobe would cause the inability or the struggle to actually speak words. So while you might understand what people are saying, you'll actually have a very difficult time using your motor functions to produce the movements needed to make the words that you speak. So Paul Broca found this on one of his patients that he had worked with for over 30 years, and after his death they did an autopsy on him and they saw a lesion in this region of the brain. And then they continued to see this in other patients who had passed. And so this gave them probable cause to make an association that lesions in this region of the brain cause a difficulty with language expression. And you'll generally see this in stroke victims. The second association area that we're going to talk about here is the Wernicke's area. So the Wernicke's area controls language comprehension and expression. Again, located in the left temporal lobe. And so something called a language impairment called aphasia. If you've heard of aphasia, it's linked to damage in the Wernicke's area. So while people might be able to still speak, they will speak meaningless words. And I've also posted a video of what aphasia looks like, what aphasia is, what it looks like, and on the Google Docs. So I encourage you to go check that out so you can understand and actually see what I'm talking about here in regards to this association area. All right, so this is going to be it for part one. I'm going to leave you guys here with a little mini FRQ. As you can read this prompt here, Anthony plays in high school band, and I want you to identify one way that each lobe of his brain is active as he participates in the concert. So give an example regarding the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. Okay, so this is it for part one, and then part two I will talk more about the hemispheres and Michael Gazzanica's research on split brain research and also brain plasticity. All right, thanks guys, see you later.